August 15, 1947. You are standing in Delhi among a crowd filled with silence and disbelief as the Union Jack is lowered for the final time. After roughly 2 centuries of domination, British rule over India, the jewel in the crown of the empire, finally comes to an end. Not out of compassion, not because of a moral awakening, and not because Britain suddenly began to believe in freedom. It ended for a simpler reason. Britain was bankrupt. World War II had hollowed out its economy. National debt had surged past 200% of GDP. The treasury was empty, and without draining India's wealth, there was no longer any way to finance the empire. What few people realize is this: India's independence was not a gift. It was a financial surrender. Britain did not grant freedom. It simply no longer had the power to maintain control. And when India slipped away, the entire imperial system began to unravel. To understand how this empire collapsed, we must return to where it all began. December 31st, 1600. Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter granting a group of English merchants exclusive trading rights with lands east of Africa and west of the Pacific. This entity was called the East India Company. At first it appeared harmless, trading spices, textiles, and tea. But day by day it transformed into something never seen before. By the 18th century, the East India Company commanded a private army of 260,000 men, twice the size of Britain's own military. A company with its own army, its own currency, its own laws, and soon its own empire. This was not free market capitalism. This was corporate sovereignty. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. After defeating the Nawab of Bengal, the company was granted the Diwani, the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. That meant direct control over 30 million people and one of the wealthiest regions on earth. Within a few years, the East India Company shifted from merchant to monarch. It ruled. It taxed. It exploited. Salt, tobacco, and opium were monopolized. Indian artisans were forced to sell their goods at prices 40% below market value. Weavers who had produced the world's finest fabrics for generations were reduced to bonded laborers. This was not mismanagement. This was the business model. Then came the Bengal famine of 1769 to 1770. Between 7 and 10 million people died from hunger and thirst. The company provided no relief. Tax collection continued as usual. People were not ignored. They were accounted for financially. This was not a policy failure. This was the policy itself. Pause for a moment and consider what that means. In 1750, India produced roughly 25% of global industrial output. By 1900, that figure had fallen to just 2%. India was not conquered. It was de-industrialized. British goods flooded Indian markets tariff-free, while Indian producers were crushed under heavy taxation. British factories bought cotton for almost nothing, processed it at home, and sold finished goods back to India. Profit was guaranteed. Competition was destroyed. Between 1850 and 1896, textile imports from Britain to India surged from 5 million to 18 million. India's skilled weavers were wiped out. Between 1600 and 1871, India's GDP per capita fell from over 60% of Britain's to less than 15%. This was not accidental. It was systematic. Then came the opium trade. The East India Company became the largest drug dealer in history. Indian farmers were forced to grow opium. Britain exported it to China in exchange for silver and tea. When China resisted, Britain went to war. The Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 were not fought for defense or freedom. They were fought to protect a revenue stream. Opium became the second largest source of income for the British government, surpassed only by land taxes. India was both the plantation of the empire and its victim. In 1857, Indian soldiers within the company's own army rose in revolt. It was one of the greatest uprisings in colonial history. Britain crushed the rebellion brutally, and then sent the bill to India. The entire cost of suppressing the revolt was charged to Indian taxpayers. They paid for their own defeat. Afterward, the British Crown dissolved the company and took direct control. Exploitation did not end. It expanded deliberately. By the late 19th century, more than half of India's state revenues were being used to finance Britain's military presence. Railways are often described as Britain's great gift to India. The truth is far darker. Between 1860 and 1890, India's rail network expanded from 1,300 kilometers to over 25,000. India went into debt. The materials were purchased from Britain. The profits flowed back to Britain. Infrastructure was built not for the people, but to move troops and goods. Indian economist Dadabhai Naoroji called this system the drain of wealth. He calculated that Britain extracted between $30 and $40 million annually while reinvesting almost nothing. He called it vampirism. And he was right. When a nation's wealth leaves and never returns, that nation bleeds. This drain deepened during the World Wars. In World War I, more than 1 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain. Over 150,000 were killed or wounded. India also shipped millions of tons of wheat, cotton, and raw materials, paid for by India itself. The colony even donated £100 million to Britain's war effort. In World War II, the situation became catastrophic. The British Indian Army grew to 3.35 million men, the largest volunteer force in history. Britain financed the war through sterling balances, debts owed to India. By 1945, India was Britain's largest creditor. Then came the Bengal famine of 1943. Between 800,000 and 3.8 million people died. Food was diverted to Europe. Winston Churchill dismissed the crisis, saying Indians should learn to look after themselves. At this point, the empire was not only bankrupt, it was morally broken. By the end of the war, Britain's debt had reached twice the size of its economy. Exports had collapsed. The empire was insolvent. The United States provided a $3.75 billion loan. Canada added another $1.9 billion. Britain did not finish repaying these debts until 2006, but the empire was already dead. On June 3, 1947, Britain announced its withdrawal. On August 15th, the flag came down, not as an act of grace, but as a necessity. In 1700, India accounted for 27% of global GDP. By 1947, that share had fallen to 4%. Britain's share, meanwhile, rose from 2.9% to 9% at the height of colonial extraction. For 200 years, Britain's rise was India's decline. When the drain stopped, the empire stopped. After independence, India began to rebuild. Life expectancy doubled. Economic capacity returned. In a few decades of self-rule, India achieved what nearly 2 centuries of colonial development never did. The British Empire dissolved. The sun finally set, but history does not repeat itself. It rhymes. Today, the United States is experiencing what Britain once did, a global power. widespread military presence, and a financial system under strain. Britain extracted from colonies. America relies on the dollar. Different mechanisms, the same mathematics. Empires do not collapse in a single day. They bleed out slowly through debt, overextension, and the illusion that power is permanent. Britain's greatest mistake was not only financial, it was believing the drain could last forever. When the bill came due, history collected, and it always does.